with combined services in the local area. In many cases, several churches are getting together. In our case, two churches are getting together. We're going to be coming together for a special service. But going even further, going beyond that, for the Feast of Tabernacles, we're going to be packing up. We're going to be going somewhere. We're most from here going to Biloxi or perhaps to Big Sandy, and some to various other places, even more far-flung. But wherever you go and wherever God's people congregate around the world, because we have people who are congregating in a wide variety of places, some of these places maybe we would have trouble locating on a map, and we would certainly have trouble pronouncing if we were to see the names of some of these locations, and Asia and Africa and in the Pacific Islands and down in Central and South America, and places that most of us are not all that familiar with, and the names look somewhat intimidating and they're far off. And yet if you were there and you began to talk to these people, you would find individuals that are committed to and are trying to live the same way of life that you're trying to live, who believe the same basic doctrines, who are looking forward to and anticipating the same set of overall solutions to the problems that this world faces that you are anticipating, that I am anticipating. Well, God tells us in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 14, we will pick it up in verse 22. He says, "You shall truly tithe all the increase of your seed that the field brings forth year by year. And you shall eat before the Eternal your God in the place which He shall choose to place His name there. The tithe of your corn, of your wine, of your oil, and the firstlings of your flock and of your herds, that you may learn to fear the Eternal your God always." Now, we read here of a tithe that we in the church have frequently called second tithe. That is not, by the way, just some name that is unique to us. That is the name that the Jews utilized anciently too. The term that was used in the time of Christ was deuterodecton, which meant just second tithe. Deutero is the word that our word Deuteronomy comes from. It means the second law or second giving of the law. Well, that was what the Jews termed it, and the reason they termed it that, and the reason we term it that, is because it is the second tithe that is mentioned in the Bible. There is a tithe that we read of earlier, going all the way back to Genesis 14, that was given that was in that sense payable to God for the carrying out of His work. We read in the book of Numbers that God assigned in ancient Israel the tithe to the priesthood, that they were responsible for the work of the sanctuary, and God, in that sense, then gave them the tithes, or paid to the Levites the tithes for their service in the sanctuary, because they, in that sense, were working for God. The tithe belonged to God, and we read of that. We read various places that discuss it. But when we come into Deuteronomy 14, we come to a second tithe, a tithe that was not paid to the Levites, but rather we're told in verse 23 was eaten before the Eternal. It was consumed or utilized by the individual. It was something the individual and his family utilized themselves. But it had a particular use and it had a particular purpose. It was utilized in the place that God chose to put His name there. It was used in the place that God selected. And it was utilized so that the people might learn to fear the eternal God always. It goes on in verse 24 and 25 that make plain that it's not Some people have gotten hung up because the specific agricultural produce that is enumerated there. Well, the people to whom it was addressed were in an agrarian economy, as of course was the case in our nation up until more recent years. We have moved more and more from a rural to an urban economy. At the time this nation had its beginnings, the first census of the United States in 1790, 90% of the population of this country was rural and 10% was urban. By 1990, 200 years, we have exactly reversed that to where now 90% of the population of the country is urban and 10% is rural. So if you look back, you find, I think it was right around 1900, it's either 1890 or 1900 that the scales tipped, and we moved past the 50% mark for urban versus rural, and that has continued to grow in this area and throughout the South. That was the change from rural to urban was much later, and to a great extent was a post-World War II change in most of the South. But so it was addressed to people in a rural economy, and it addressed the things that they were not primarily a cash economy. They were it was more of a barter system and more of a small farmer type of circumstance. So it was specifically mentioned. But verses 24 and 25 make plain that money is the equivalent. You know that you it's a long ways, and you can't always transport the produce. The issue is not the produce or the specific agricultural commodities. You can sell that and take the money. And that, of course, is what normally all of us do, because that is much the simpler case. But anyway, the point is, verse 26, you take this that you have set aside to the place that God has chosen, that He has selected, and in verse 26, you bestow that for whatever you want, whatever you desire. And it enumerates various things that are enumerated in the context of feasting, in the context of celebrating these special occasions. You're to do these things and to eat there before the eternal your God. You shall rejoice, you and your household. So it was a family time. Now, if you notice, there are two specific things that there's two specific reasons that we are instructed to set aside this tithe that is to be utilized in this manner. Verse 23 says, we are to eat this tithe before God in the place that He chooses. Why? That we may learn to fear the eternal our God always. Down in verse 26, we're told that we're to bestow it for whatever we desire, and we're to eat it there before the eternal our God, and we're told you shall rejoice, you and your household. So there are two reasons that we are instructed here that we are to set aside this second tithe or festival tithe, this portion that is to be utilized for the feast. There are two reasons that we are told it is to be set apart and set aside. It is to be set aside first, and there's a reason why they're mentioned in this particular order. First and foremost, that we may learn to fear the eternal our God always, and secondarily, that we may rejoice before God with our household. Now, the starting point is that we may learn to fear God. Now, this is a term that we don't hear utilized that often, and many times it has a negative connotation. You say fear, and people think of terror. They think of hiding from someone, kind of hiding in a corner because someone is going to get you. And the fear of God, boy, God's going to get you. And, God is out to with this kind of an idea that some have. Now that's not what the fear of God is all about. God does not want us hiding, quivering, cowering in a corner somewhere, hiding under the table because we think God's going to get us. We don't go to the Feast of Tabernacles to try to hide in a closet because we think God's going to get us. That is not what is talked about. There are healthy fears and unhealthy fears. There are things I'm afraid to do. I would be afraid to get out and stand on the railroad track with a train coming straight toward me. I consider that a healthy fear. I'm a lot healthier being afraid to do that than I would be if I were not afraid to do it. Well, I'm not afraid of anything. I'll stand here in front of this train. I probably wouldn't stay healthy for very long. A little child, fear is something we learn. A little child sometimes will do things that are very dangerous because they haven't learned even a healthy fear. Sometimes a little child will get into water that's too deep. I've seen them sometimes, they're sitting there and just jump off into like a swimming pool or something, and all of a sudden realize that the water was too deep and they couldn't swim. But they were having fun and they just kind of lunged on forward. They didn't have a healthy fear. Now generally when they came up, sputtering and crying, after then they did. Now that's the hard way to learn it, and if a parent or somebody's right there to get them out, well, it's maybe no real serious problem. If someone is not right there to get them out, it could be fatal. So fear does not have to be equated with some negative, terrible thing. I have what I consider to be a healthy fear of electricity. Now, that doesn't mean I'm afraid to turn on a light switch. No, I have no problem turning on a light switch. But what I would have a problem doing is taking the light switch off and just kind of reaching in there with my hand, maybe some metal implements, and just kind of reaching in there and grabbing a hold of things and playing around with it. If I have to change out something, I want to be very, very careful as to what I'm doing, and I don't want to take unnecessary chances. That there are people who have gotten sometimes too familiar and too comfortable. I remember a case years ago that really vividly impressed me because it was a man who was the school bus driver. When I was a little community where I lived, and on up until I was, I guess probably I was in junior high or late elementary school when he died, probably around 6th or 7th grade, but he drove the school bus. But during the day, he painted and did things of this sort, kind of worked as a independent contractor to do house painting and sometimes simple electrical repairs. And he was killed in an accident that involved carelessness with electricity, where he had I guess worked around it so often that he took a careless chance. He had gotten away from having a healthy fear, and he was electrocuted. Very tragic kind of a thing, and something that really, of course, makes a very vivid impression on you as a child when something like that happens to someone you know. The point is that fear, there is a healthy fear. There are unhealthy fears and healthy fears, and God wants us to learn a proper fear of Him. And one of the reasons He instructs us to go to the feast and to observe God's festivals, one of the things that we should come away with is a more deeply developed, proper fear of God. Now, perhaps we could use a different word that is a synonym that means the same thing, because the fear of God means a deep reverence for God. It means standing in awe of God, being deeply impressed. Overwhelmingly impressed with God, standing in awe of Him. Now, let's look a little bit. You see, when you fear something, you're impressed with it. You're awed and overwhelmed by its magnitude. That's what it means to be afraid of something or to have a fear of something. You're awed and overwhelmed by its magnitude. You're deeply impressed with it. Now, you see, all of us have certain fears. Mr. Rice made comment earlier in the sermon, or sermonette, concerning some of the fears that many times our young children deal with at school. The fears of what other people are going to think. Well, it talks about that fear in Proverbs 29:25. It says, the fear of man brings a snare. The fear of man brings a snare. When you're afraid of people and what people are going to think and what people are going to do, when what people think is the important, overwhelming thing to you, it's going to bring a snare, a trap. A lot of you know what a snare is. Some of you have made snares. You've used snares in trapping animals. Well, the fear of man brings a snare. That's a trap. It can serve to entrap and to entangle us, to catch us up. The fear of man brings a snare. The worry about what people are going to say and what people are going to do and how it's going to come across to people. And we can get so concerned about what people are going to think and what people are going to do that it is a trap to us. The fear of man brings a snare, but whoso puts his trust in the Lord shall be safe. In Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 1, it says, the wicked flee when no man pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. So there is a boldness that comes when the fear of man is cast out. The wicked flee when no man pursues. You ever notice, when you're doing something you shouldn't do, you got a guilty conscience, how jumpy you get. You remember as a kid, you were doing something that you knew you weren't supposed to do, and every time you heard a noise, you jumped because you knew, Dad or Mom was about to come through the door. And so, just real jumpy. The wicked flees when no man pursues. Well, when your conscience is guilty and you don't feel good about what you're doing, then you get kind of jumpy. The righteous are bold as a lion. When you're doing what you ought to do, there is a confidence that you can have. We've all experienced that, even in a physical sense. In Revelation chapter 21, in verse 7, it says, he that overcomes shall inherit all things, and I'll be his God, and he shall be my son. But the fearful, and the unbelieving, and abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and all sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars, shall have their part in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Now the first category it mentions here are the fearful. He that overcomes shall inherit all things, but the fearful and the unbelieving, and it goes on through. Why are the fearful mentioned? Well, if you go back to Numbers 13 and 14, you find the illustration that explained to us why the fearful lead the list. When God brought Israel out of Egypt to lead them from Egypt into the Promised Land, they came up to the Jordan River, and a great number of the people, after they sent the spies in, you remember the 12 spies went into the land, came back with their report, and they said, it's great land, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but there are giants in the land. And the people were overwhelmed with fear. The people refused to go forward where God was leading because they were afraid. They were afraid to follow where God led. And because they were afraid to go where God led, which was into the Promised Land, they never entered the Promised Land. They didn't enter in because of unbelief. They didn't believe God. They were more afraid of the giants. They were more impressed with the giants than they were impressed with God. All they could see was the giants, and they were overwhelmed. The fear of man was a snare. They were afraid of people. They were afraid of the things that lay before them humanly and physically, and it overwhelmed them to the point that they lost sight of God's greatness and God's power. They lost sight of being impressed with God, and they were so impressed with people, they ceased to be impressed with God, and they didn't follow where God led them. Now that's what it means when it says the unbelieving or the fearful there in Revelation 21. The reason the fearful won't be there is because they're afraid to follow. They're afraid to go where God leads. They're afraid to cross the River Jordan. They're afraid to go into the Promised Land for fear that there may be problems and difficulties that will be encountered along the way. And so they stop. They stop. You know, God will lead, God will guide, God will direct, God will protect, God will do all those things. And He did all those things for ancient Israel. He provided for them where even their shoes and their clothes didn't wear out. He overshadowed them with a cloud by day from the scorching sun. He gave them a pillar of fire at night to warm them and to be a source of light. He fed them with manna. He miraculously poured water out of a rock. God took care of them. He did all of those things. He fought their enemies. He opened up the Red Sea before them. He did many, many things, but the one thing He didn't do was He didn't pick them up and carry them in, you know, kicking and screaming. They had their part to do, and what was their part? It was to put one foot in front of the other and follow where God led. That's all they had to do. They had to put one foot in front of the other and just follow where He led. God would take care of all kinds of things. But they had to follow. And they had to follow their own free will. God would not forcibly drag them in. He wasn't going to, dig their heels in. God wasn't going to just drag them across the river, whether they wanted to come or not. So, when we fear something, we're deeply impressed with it. We can be awed and overwhelmed by its magnitude. Being overly impressed with people and their power can block us out of God's inheritance. God has for us the desire that we enter into His rest, that we inherit His kingdom. God has a tremendous plan, and He has tremendous promises in store that He plans to fulfill in our lives. But ultimately, the extent to which these things are fulfilled in our lives are going to come down as to what we are most impressed with. Are we most impressed with the world, or are we most impressed with God? And ultimately, what we're most impressed with really kind of comes down as to what is the most real to us. What's the most real to us? How real is God and God's kingdom and God's promises and God's power? How real is the great God, the creator of the universe? The one who flung out the stars, the suns, the solar systems, all of the planets, all of the greatness and the grandeur, the things that we see. David in the Psalms writes, talks about how when I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, and the firmament, your handiwork. When I look up into the sky at night, and you look at all that God has done, man can't even count how many there are, and can't even begin to get to even the closest one. And God made them all. He not only knows how many there are, He knows their names. Not only can He get to all of them, He made them all. Man can't even get there. The closest one would take us several years if we could send something traveling at the speed of light, which we can't. The closest star, Alpha Centauri. And the furthest ones would take us billions of years if we were traveling at the speed of light, which we can't even begin to do. It'll still take us billions of years. So, when you consider what God is and what God has done and God's greatness and power, and you look at all the things that God has done, and we can come right on down to looking at the smallest and the most minute and thing that we can look at here on this earth, and the interrelationships that develop, and realize that God planned out everything from the smallest detail to the grandest and greatest thing. But you see, when we get so impressed with people, and we live in a world where we're surrounded with what man can do. We're impressed with man and man's power and man's technology and what man can figure out and what man can do. And what we look around and see, this world is in a mess. Any way you want to slice it. Now God holds out hope to His people, and that hope is based on the reality of His promises. God wants us to go to the feast to learn of whom we're to be deeply impressed. Learn to fear Him. You see, if we're too impressed with people, and we're overwhelmed and overawed by people and what people can do, it can keep us back and interfere with our doing what we need to do. One of the greatest obstacles, I think the greatest barrier to spiritual growth is the barrier of fear. Being fearful. Fearful to step out and to do what we need to do. Fearful of getting hurt. Sometimes the reason we don't reconcile with someone else is because we're afraid they'll hurt us again. Sometimes the reason that we fail to do this or fail to do that, or we don't do what God says, or we cave in here or there, is because we're afraid. We get scared of the consequence and we cave in. And the reason we get scared is because we get so impressed with what we can see that we lose sight of the most real thing there is, which is what we can't see. You see, we're to walk by faith and not by sight. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. He that comes to God must believe that He is, and that He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. So the wrong kind of fear is something that needs to be replaced with the right kind. Let's notice in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7. Proverbs 1 and verse 7, it says, "The fear of the eternal is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." The fear of the eternal is the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning. It is the starting point, the principal part. It's what you have to start with. And it is really the basis on which you build everything else. The fear of God, standing in awe of God, really being deeply impressed with how great and how powerful is our God. That's the starting point to learn anything. Proverbs 8:13, it says, "The fear of the eternal is to hate evil. Pride and arrogancy and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate." What is the fear of God? The fear of God is to hate evil. When you're really impressed with God, you want to be just like Him. When you're really impressed with somebody, you want to copy them. You want to be like them. You remember as a kid, you remember being impressed with certain ones? You know, I can remember as a boy, some of the heroes, think of back of, the Lone Ranger and Hopalong Cassidy and various ones. Some of you remember those. And I can remember really being impressed. And I was impressed with how that, they could come and just, jump on that horse from the rear, just put their, just jump into the saddle and take off into the sunset. Boy, that was impressive. And I can remember as a little kid, I had a donkey. And, yet somehow, and I named my donkey after the Lone Ranger's horse, but somehow the donkey never quite got the big picture. I could give him that famous cowboy mount, and he would just kind of stand there and put his head down and steady himself with his legs, but he just never really took off flying into the sunset. Any of you who've ever had a donkey or a mule realizes the problems in motivating animals such as that. He was a little hard to motivate sometimes, but a kid grows up and they're impressed with something. Now, it can show up in styles. It can show up in the things we try to copy. But what we're impressed with, we try to copy. We try to copy. Now, what we're impressed with can either be something constructive or it can be something destructive. But what we're impressed with, we try to copy. The fear of the eternal is to hate evil. If we're really impressed with God, if we really stand in awe of God, if our desire is to be just like God, because if we're really impressed with God, we want to be just like Him. If we're overwhelmed with the magnitude of God's greatness and God's power and who and what God is and how wonderful God is, and we're really overwhelmed with the magnitude and power of God, we want to be just like Him. And that's going to lead us to hate evil. Because if we're trying to be just like God and we desire to be just like God, then there are things we don't want to be. So it is a state of mind and attitude. In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 6, it says, "By mercy and truth iniquity is purged, and by the fear of the eternal men depart from evil." By mercy and truth, we get rid of iniquity. We get rid of lawlessness. We have to face the truth. God is ready to extend His mercy to give us an opportunity to change. You see, if God didn't give us a chance to change, we'd all be incinerated into a cinder. But God's mercy extends to us a chance to change. God wants to give us a chance to change. He desires for us to change. And every one of us need God's mercy. We all need God's mercy. And you know, God loves mercy. God desires to extend His mercy. By mercy and truth. You see, God is soft-hearted, but He's not soft-headed. Sometimes individuals don't understand the difference. They're people, sometimes as parents. We can be not merely soft-hearted. God is soft-hearted, tender-hearted, great mercy toward those that fear Him. But God's not soft-headed. Sometimes God knows that the most merciful thing in the long run is to let us learn a certain lesson. And God does not just instantly snap His fingers and make all of the physical consequences of everything we've ever done just disappear. God's ready to forgive, but you know, forgiveness and mercy are two different things. Now, God forgives because He's merciful, but forgiveness has to do with the restoration of our relationship with God. We go to God for forgiveness. That is, forgiveness is there to restore our relationship with God. And then as we ask God for mercy, we're asking God to really to grant us relief from some of the physical consequences that we're of problems that we're encountering. Well, God will do that, and God does do that, but sometimes there are things that we have to go through in order to have certain lessons deeply impressed on us. But by mercy and truth, iniquity is purged. That's what leads us to repentance. God extends His mercy. He extends His truth, which is the basis by which we know what is right and what is wrong. And by the fear of the eternal, men depart from evil. What's the basis of our turning away from the old ways? Because we come to a point where we're more impressed with God than we are with the world around us. By the fear of the eternal, men depart from evil. We turn our backs on the old ways because we learn to be impressed with something else. Let's just notice back in the Psalms. In Psalm 25 and verse 12 it says, "What man is he that fears the eternal? Him shall He teach in the way that he should choose." Who is it that really fears God, that stands in awe of God? Well, he's going to be taught the way that he needs to choose. You know, God has to first bring the world to the point where it's deeply impressed with Him before He can teach the world to rejoice. You know, notice in Deuteronomy 14, we saw earlier, it said we're to rejoice before the eternal. God is to be a part of our fellowship. We're to be rejoicing, as it were, in His presence. That means what we eat, what we drink, the conversation we have, that the things we do are to be done as though Jesus Christ were seated there at the table. Are there changes we would make in our fellowship if Jesus Christ walked in? Would we be hollering, wait just a minute, while he was there knocking on the door and quickly, trying to hide cans and bottles and get stuff out of the way? Because we'd be embarrassed for him to see all the stuff that we had out there? Would we, quickly change the program we were watching on television or maybe turn it off? Would we change the conversation and all of a sudden, totally different topics are introduced? Well, if we would have to make any great abrupt changes, then we need to realize we're not rejoicing before God in the way that He would have us. Because we are to rejoice in a way that God is included in our fellowship. That our rejoicing would be made more complete for Jesus Christ to come in and to sit down and to be there to partake with us in the way that He was when He walked the earth as a human being. You read in the New Testament, Jesus Christ was not a party poop. He was someone that people enjoyed being with. He was a very enjoyable person. He exuded a personality that was such that people really enjoyed being with Him. He could laugh and have a good time, but He always did it in the right way. He could eat and drink and take part in these type of things. Now, some of the Pharisees wanted to criticize Him for it and accuse Him of being a drunkard and a glutton, which He was not. He was not those things at all. But He could enjoy a good time in the right way. And there's nothing wrong with a good time in the right way. God talks about that in Deuteronomy 14. But you see, before we can learn to have a good time, first we have to learn to be impressed with God. Because if we're impressed with God, we're going to have a good time the right way. Because we're going to realize that He's there. He's there. See, it says in Psalms 1, blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. It's not caught up in the attitudes of the society around. His delight is in the law of the Lord. And in His law does he meditate day and night. That's what he's caught up in. That's what he's wrapped up in. He'll be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth his fruit in his season. His leaf shall not wither, and whatever he does will prosper. He's going to last. He's going to endure. Because he's impressed not with the world and those who are scornful of God's way and following a contrary way, but his delight's in the law of the Lord. He's thinking about these things, and he's impressed with God and God's way, and he is headed a way that's going to last, a way that is going to endure. The ungodly are not so. They're like the chaff which is driven before the wind. They're not going to stand in the judgment. Sinners aren't going to endure there in the congregation of the righteous. Because the Lord knows the way of the righteous, the way of the ungodly is going to perish. There's a way that's going to cease, and there's a way that's going to endure forever. What are we going to cling to? What are we going to hold to? What's going to last? What's going to endure? We go as we attend the Feast of Tabernacles, as we dwell in temporary dwellings, we are focused in upon the temporary nature of this physical life. There is something beyond the tabernacle in which we dwell, something beyond the temporary state of our present existence. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we're told in Hebrews 11, dwelt in tabernacles. They dwelt in temporary dwellings, but we're told that they looked for a city whose maker and builder is God. Now, if they had been mindful from that city out of whence they came, if they had been looking back to Babylon of old, they may have had opportunities to have returned. But they knew that the future didn't lie in Babylon of old, or the Chaldees out of which they had come. The future was in the kingdom of God. And they looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. And that city has foundations. In fact, you find them enumerated back in the book of Revelation. It has 12 foundations. So it goes deep. It's enumerated back in the book of Revelation. It is a city whose maker and builder is God. It's a city, the New Jerusalem, that's going to come down from God out of heaven, that is going to endure on into eternity. You see, as we are put in a circumstance where we become very mindful of our temporary state and of our need to look beyond the temporary state to something that is permanent, our need to look beyond a tabernacle to a city whose maker and builder is God. In chapter 2 it says, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cord from us." You read of all the scurrying around that man is going to do and the things that are going to result right prior to the return of Christ, and the armies that are going to gather there outside, gather at Armageddon and converge there on Jerusalem, that Christ is going to deal with in the valley of Jehoshaphat outside of Jerusalem. He that sits in the heavens is going to laugh. God's going to look down and it's going to look like a bunch of little ants scurrying around. God's going to look down and He's going to laugh. Oh, that's ridiculous. Then shall He speak unto them in His wrath and vex them in His sore displeasure. Yet if I set my king upon the holy mount, the holy hill of Zion, I shall declare the decree. The Lord has said unto me, You are my son, this day have I begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. You'll break them with a rod of iron, you'll dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Be wise now, therefore, O you kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest He be angry and you perish from the way, when His wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in Him. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. In other words, stand in awe of God. The world is going to have to be brought to a point where it is first deeply impressed with God. God is far off and unreal to the world. They think God is dead. God is some remote first cause. God is not actively involved in what's going on. God does not seem real. God is far off and far removed. People go heedless about their way, pursuing their own way, doing their own thing. The world around us doesn't really give a whole lot of thought about what God has to say. We look at our nation and the state of things, and the state of morality and ethics, the state of our family. We look at these things and we realize there's no fear of God before their eyes. They're not deeply impressed with God. God does not seem very real. God doesn't play a very big part. So the world's first going to have to come to the point where they're deeply impressed with God, because the basis of being able to rejoice before God and to have a good time before God is to first and foremost be deeply impressed with God. God tells us, as we focus in on this festival season, and the reason God tells us to prepare and to save up and to make preparation and to come to the place where God has set His name is we are to come there, we're to do these things that we might learn to be more deeply impressed with God than the world around us. We're to learn to be more and more deeply impressed with the great God, with His power, with His greatness, with His grandeur, with His plan, with His great purpose. And you see, this is the kind of proper fear, the kind of healthy fear, not being in terror of people and what people might do, but the proper fear and respect for God that leads to joy. Psalm 19 and verse 1, it says, The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows His handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. There's no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. You know, regardless of where you are, you can look up and you can see the heavens. They declare the glory of God. They announce God's power, God's greatness, God's glory. Verse 7, the law of the eternal is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. So God's law, God's doctrine is perfect. It converts, it changes our life. God's law is for the purpose of changing our life. That's what it means to convert the soul. changing our life. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The illustrations, the examples, the witnesses and records of what God has done in the lives of His people, they're there to make wise the simple. They help us understand. See, God fills the Bible with examples and illustrations. This is what is meant by testimonies. So we learn God's will not simply from thou shalt and thou shalt not. We learn it by illustrations and examples of what people did and what God was pleased with and what He wasn't pleased with. It is a source of wisdom because it gives us practical application of the principles of the law. You know, it's one thing you can go through and memorize a whole list of do's and don'ts. But when it comes down to your life, it is a matter of understanding how do you apply the principle in this or that real life situation. How do you apply the principles of God's law in marriage, in dealing with your children, or in deciding whom to marry, or in the way you conduct yourself prior to marriage, or in the way you conduct yourself after marriage, or in the way you conduct yourself on the job. You know, there are many statements, but there are also many examples and illustrations of things people did and consequences that were good or bad. So it's all there to change our lives, to make us wise. The statutes of the eternal are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the eternal is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the eternal are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, more than fine gold, sweeter than honey in the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned, and in keeping of them is great reward. Who can understand his errors? Cleanse you me from secret faults. Keep me back from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over them. You see, it's a matter of focusing in on God and God's way and the things that God gives us. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verse 29, God says, "Oh, that there were such a heart in them that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever." Oh, that there were such a heart in them. I wish they were oriented toward that. Chapter 6 goes on that these are the commandments, the statutes, the judgments. These are the things there. Verse 2, that you might fear the eternal your God. That you might really be impressed with God to do all these things. You're to love God, verse 5, with all your heart and soul and might. You're to teach these things diligently to your children. We're told in verse 24 that God commanded us these things to fear Him, to stand in awe of Him for our good always. It's for our benefit. We could go on, we could look. Chapter 10. Chapter 10 of Deuteronomy in verse 12. "And now, Israel, what does the eternal your God require of you but to fear the eternal your God and to walk in all His ways, to love Him and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and His statutes, which I command you this day for your good." What does God command you? What does God want? What does He require? He wants us to fear Him, to really stand in awe of Him, to be deeply impressed with Him. And as a result of that, to walk in His ways. To love Him, to serve Him with our whole heart. From the inside out, not outward service, man, in the eyes of man, not simply going through a certain external conformity with certain rules, but an inward transformation that comes from the whole orientation of our mind and thinking in our life. And of course, if there's an inward transformation, it's going to reveal itself in terms of our external actions, what we do and don't do, the liberties that we allow ourselves and those from which we restrain ourselves, are going to be a reflection of the inner person. If the change takes place on the inside, it'll reflect on the out. That's true. But what God is after is not simply external conformity. He's after an inward transformation. That's what conversion is all about. And it gets back to being predicated to really the fear of God, really being in awe of God, which is going to lead us then to try to follow Him, try to copy Him, and to do these things with our whole heart. He says in verse 16, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked. Chapter 11, verse 1, you shall love the Lord your God, and keep His charge, His statutes, His judgments, His commandments always. Verse 19 says, and you shall teach them to your children. Talk about it and instruct them. Do these things. And then in chapter 12, he says, now these are the things that I'm giving you. And in verse 5, unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all the tribes to put His name there, even unto His habitation shall you seek, and there shall you come. And there you're to bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes. You're to come to where God has set His name. In verse 7, you'll eat before the eternal your God and rejoice in all that you put your hand to, you and your households. See, verse 9, you're not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which God gives you. But when you go over Jordan and you dwell in the land which the Lord your God gives you, and when He gives you rest from all your enemies round about so that you dwell in safety, there's going to be a place where God is going to choose to cause His name to dwell there. There you're to come before God. And verse 12, you're to rejoice before the Lord your God there, you and your sons, your daughters, your men servants, your maid servants, the Levite that's within your gate, for as much as he has no partner inheritance with you. Don't go and just do your own thing. Don't, in verse 17, you're not to eat within your gate of the tithe of your corn, your wine, your oil. In other words, you're not to use it for just secular, mundane purposes, but you're to eat it before the eternal, in the place which He shall choose. Verse 18. You and your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, the Levite that's within your gates, you shall rejoice before the eternal your God in all that you put your hand to. You're to rejoice there before God. The whole world is going to ultimately come to a point of rejoicing. You know, it tells us that in Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14 verse 1, the Eternal will yet have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel. And He'll set them in their own land. And verse 3, it'll come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and from the hard bondage wherein you were made to serve. You see, because our people haven't feared God, what have we feared instead? We feared what other people thought. We feared what other nations thought. We feared, we've been motivated by the fear of man and not by the fear of God. And as a result, the fear of man causes a snare. It's led into sorrow and hard bondage. Because really, we've been impressed with Satan's world. As a nation, as a world, as a society, we've been impressed with Satan's world. And because we've been impressed with Satan's world, we have followed in with it. And it has led to heartache, to hard bondage, to a lot of hard problems. And ultimately, this nation is going to learn that lesson in order to come into the rest that God offers to His people. God tells us that we are to do certain things for the purpose of learning to fear Him more completely. When we get ready to go to the feast, what we need to have in mind is that we're going there. See, we're going there for two reasons. We're going there first and foremost to learn to fear God more deeply, to learn to stand more deeply in awe and reverence of the great God, and to rejoice before Him. And if somebody's not going there for those reasons, then they don't need to go. Because that's why we go. That's why we go. We're going there that we might learn to stand more deeply in awe of God, that we may come away more deeply impressed with God and with His power and His greatness, and that we can rejoice before Him and enjoy the good things because God wants us to have those things. You know, when the nation When our nation comes to that point in Isaiah 14:3, where God can give them rest from the sorrow and the fear and the hard bondage. See, God's going to break the staff of the wicked, verse 5, the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger, is persecuted and none hinders. God's going to deal with those things. In verse 7, the result is going to be the whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. A picture, a description of the millennium. The whole earth is at rest, entering into God's rest. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. And they break forth into singing, a time of rejoicing. But before the rejoicing, first comes the fear of God, being impressed with God, deeply in awe of God. That's something that we need to seek as we focus in on this fall festival season. We need to ask God to help us as individuals and to help us as a church to go through this fall festival season becoming more deeply impressed and awed with the great God, with His power and His greatness and His magnificence than ever before, so that we can rejoice before Him and really take part in all of the things that God desires to give us. We are entering into a very special season of God's year. A time that focuses in, and we're going to continue this focus and follow forward with more in terms of where really standing in awe of God will, can, and should lead us. So as we look forward to the fall festivals, we need to look forward to them that we might learn to be more deeply in awe of God, and that we might be able, therefore, to rejoice before Him in all that He set before us.